The music was too loud, and the lights were too bright, but none of that mattered to Damian Cole in that moment, because his eyes were locked on his wife across the ballroom, and she was laughing. Not a polite laugh. Not the tired smile she gave him at breakfast when he barely looked up from his phone. This was a real laugh, the kind that made her shoulders shake and her head tilt back, the kind he had not heard directed at him in longer than he wanted to admit. The man standing across from Elena had his hand resting lightly on her arm. He said something else, and she laughed again, brighter this time, and Damian felt something twist hard in his chest, something he did not have a name for yet. He set his glass down on a passing waiter's tray without looking at it. His jaw tightened. Around him, the charity gala continued exactly as planned, string quartet playing in the corner, waiters moving between tables with trays of champagne, important people from every corner of the city trading smiles and business cards. None of it registered anymore. Damian Cole did not lose control of a room. He had built an empire out of never losing control, out of walking into any space and knowing, before he even opened his mouth, that he already owned it. Cole Enterprises did not become one of the largest holding companies in the country because its founder let his emotions decide anything. He was 34 years old, and in the 12 years since he took over the company from his father, he had never once raised his voice in a meeting, never once shown weakness in front of a rival, never once begged anyone for anything. But right now, watching his wife smile at a stranger the way she used to smile at him, before the marriage became a series of empty dinners and one-word answers, Damian felt something close to panic, and panic was not an emotion he recognized easily, because he had spent so many years refusing to feel it. He crossed the room. He did not rush. He never rushed. But his steps were faster than usual, and by the time he reached them, his jaw had set into the same hard line his employees knew meant trouble was coming. "Elena," he said. She turned, and the laugh faded from her face, replaced by something more careful, something that looked, if he was honest with himself, like relief mixed with disappointment, like she had been enjoying herself, and now the enjoyment was over. "Damian," she said, "this is Julian Cross. We went to university together. He's an architect now. He just got back from working overseas." Julian offered his hand. He was tall, with an easy smile, and the kind of relaxed confidence that came from a man who had never needed to fight for anything in his life. Damian shook his hand once, briefly, and said nothing. "I was just telling Elena about a building I designed in Singapore," Julian said, filling the silence the way people did when they sensed tension, but did not yet understand its source. "She used to help me with my sketches back in school. Best eye for proportion I ever knew." "I didn't know that," Damian said, and the words came out flatter than he intended. Elena's eyes flickered toward him, and for a second, something passed across her face that he could not read. Was it hurt? Was it anger? He used to be able to read every expression she made. Now he was not sure when he had lost that ability, only that he had lost it. "There's a lot you don't know," Elena said quietly, and then, before he could respond, she excused herself to find her sister, leaving Damian standing beside a man he had just met, and already disliked more than he could explain. Julian watched her walk away, then turned back to Damian, with an expression that was almost sympathetic. "She's a wonderful woman," he said. "You're a lucky man." Damian did not answer. He watched Elena cross the room, greeting people with easy warmth, laughing again with her sister, moving through the crowd like she belonged to it, in a way he had never quite managed, despite years of practice. She was wearing a deep green dress he did not remember buying her, or perhaps she had bought it herself, which meant he did not even know that detail about his own wife's life anymore. He excused himself from Julian without another word, and walked toward the bar, needing something to do with his hands. The bartender poured him a drink he did not ask for, recognizing him from a dozen other events. Damian stared at the glass without drinking from it, his mind replaying the sound of Elena's laugh over and over, sharper each time, like a wound reopening. He thought about the early days of their marriage, 3 years ago now, when everything had been different. He had married Elena Hart because their family's business interests aligned, because she was intelligent and composed, and exactly the kind of partner a man in his position needed, standing beside him at events like this one. It had been, by every measure he understood at the time, a good decision. She never embarrassed him. She never made scenes. She managed the social side of his life, with a grace he privately admired but rarely mentioned. What he had not planned for, what no spreadsheet or business plan could have predicted, was that somewhere in those 3 years, he had started to need her in ways that had nothing to do with business at all. He had not admitted this to himself, not fully, not until tonight, watching another man make her laugh in a way he had forgotten how to. Across the room, Elena stood with her sister, Sophia, near the tall windows overlooking the city. Sophia leaned close, her voice low enough that Damien could not hear the words, but he could see Elena's face change as her sister spoke, could see the way her smile faded into something more tired, more resigned. "You looked happy," Sophia said. "For the first time in months, you actually looked happy." Elena glanced across the room toward her husband, who stood alone at the bar, his drink untouched, his shoulders rigid with the kind of tension she had learned to recognize from a distance. "Julian is easy to talk to," she said. "That's all it was." "Is that all it was?" Sophia asked, and there was no judgment in her voice, only concern, the kind only a sister could offer. "Because from where I was standing, it looked like you remembered what it felt like to be seen." Elena did not answer right away. She watched Damien for a moment longer, this man she had married with hope in her heart, this man who had once, in the early months of their marriage, surprised her with breakfast in bed simply because it was raining, and he thought she deserved something warm on a gray morning. That man had disappeared somewhere along the way, replaced by someone who came home late, who answered questions with single words, who seemed to view their marriage as another item on an endless list of obligations. "I'm tired, Sophia," Elena finally said. "I'm tired of being married to a man who looks at me like I'm a line item in his schedule." "Then talk to him." "I've tried. You know I've tried." Elena's voice cracked slightly, and she pressed her lips together, unwilling to let herself cry in the middle of a crowded ballroom. "I don't think there's anything left to try." Sophia squeezed her hand. "What are you saying?" Elena did not answer directly. Instead, she looked out the window at the city lights spread below them, thinking about the conversation she had been avoiding for weeks, the one she knew she needed to have, the one that would change everything. "I'm saying I don't think I can keep living like this," she said finally. "I think it might be time to talk to a lawyer." The words hung in the air between them, quiet but enormous, and neither sister noticed that Damien, walking back across the room to find his wife, had drawn close enough to catch the tail end of the sentence, carried on the noise of the party. He stopped walking. The ballroom seemed to shrink around him, the music and conversation fading into a dull hum beneath the ringing in his ears. He had heard 4 words clearly: talk to a lawyer. He did not move for a long moment. He simply stood there, a man who commanded boardrooms and closed deals worth more money than most people would see in a lifetime, completely frozen by 4 words spoken by his own wife. Elena turned then and saw him standing several feet away, saw the expression on his face, and understood immediately that he had heard something he was not supposed to hear. Her stomach dropped. "Damien," she said carefully. He did not answer. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he thought was permanent and has just discovered might not be, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, Elena saw something in his eyes that was not distance, or distraction, or the careful blankness he wore like armor. She saw fear. "We should go home," he said quietly. Elena hesitated, glancing at Sophia, who gave her a small nod, silent encouragement to go, to face whatever conversation was coming. Elena said her goodbyes and followed her husband out of the ballroom, the sound of the party fading behind them as they walked toward the entrance, neither one speaking. The car ride home was silent. Elena sat by the window, watching the city lights blur past, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Damien sat across from her, staring straight ahead, his mind racing through possibilities he did not know how to organize. He was a man who solved problems for a living, who found solutions where other people saw only obstacles, and yet in this moment, faced with the possible collapse of his own marriage, he had absolutely no idea what to do. When they arrived home, Elena went straight to the kitchen, needing something to occupy her hands, filling the kettle with water she had no real intention of drinking. Damien followed her, stopping in the doorway, watching her back as she stood at the counter, her shoulders tense. "How much did you hear?" she asked without turning around. "Enough," he said. She turned to face him then, her expression unreadable, guarded in a way that hurt him more than he expected. Then you already know what I'm going to say. Say it anyway, he said. I want to hear it from you. Elena took a breath, steadying herself. I don't think this is working, Damien. I don't think it's been working for a long time. You come home late, or not at all. When you're here, you're not really here. I don't know the last time you asked me how my day was, and actually waited to hear the answer. I feel like I'm married to a stranger who happens to share my house. Every word landed like a small blow, and Damien stood there and took each one without flinching, because some part of him, buried under years of practiced control, knew she was telling the truth. I didn't realize, he started, but Elena cut him off. That's exactly the problem, she said, her voice rising slightly for the first time. You didn't realize. You never realize, because you're always somewhere else, thinking about the next deal, the next meeting, the next quarter's numbers. I used to think that once things settled at the company, you would come back to me. But things never settle, Damien. There's always another deal, always another crisis, always another reason to work until midnight. He wanted to argue. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that he had never meant to disappear from their marriage, that the company had simply demanded more of him than he expected. But standing there, looking at the exhaustion in her eyes, exhaustion that had nothing to do with a late night and everything to do with years of feeling invisible, he could not find the words to defend himself, because he was no longer sure he had a defense. I saw the way you looked at that man tonight, he said instead, and the words came out rougher than he intended. Elena's eyes narrowed slightly. Julian? Is that what this is about? You're worried about Julian? I'm worried, Damien said, and then stopped, surprised by his own honesty, surprised by how difficult it was to finish the sentence. I'm worried that I've lost you. The kitchen fell silent. Elena studied his face, searching for something, some sign that this was more than guilt or pride talking, some sign that the man standing in front of her actually meant what he had just said. You can't lose something you never really held on to, she said quietly, and the words cut deeper than anything else she had said that night. She set down the kettle she had never used and walked past him, out of the kitchen, leaving him standing alone, under the bright overhead light, staring at the space where she had been standing only moments before. Damien did not follow her. He stood there for a long time, replaying her words, replaying the sound of her laugh from earlier in the evening, a laugh that had not been meant for him in years. He thought about the man he had built himself into, the man who never begged, who never showed weakness, who solved every problem with strategy and control. He realized, standing alone in his own kitchen at nearly midnight, that for the first time in his adult life, he had no strategy at all. He only had the terrifying possibility that he was about to lose the one person he had never allowed himself to admit he needed. Upstairs, he heard the soft click of their bedroom door closing, followed by silence. He remained in the kitchen a while longer, staring at nothing, feeling something inside him crack open that he had spent years keeping sealed shut. Somewhere in that silence, a decision began to take shape, quiet and uncertain, but real. He did not yet know what he would do about it. He only knew that the ground beneath him, ground he had always assumed was solid, had just shifted, and there was no version of his old self equipped to stand steady on it. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Damien Cole was afraid. Morning light filled the kitchen when Elena came downstairs, and she found Damien already there, sitting at the table with 2 cups of coffee, one of them clearly meant for her, still steaming. He had not slept. That much was obvious from the shadows under his eyes. But he was dressed for work, his tie already knotted, his laptop closed and pushed to the side as if he had decided, for once, that it could wait. You didn't have to do this, Elena said, eyeing the coffee with suspicion, unsure what to make of the gesture after the conversation from the night before. I wanted to, he said. Can we talk before I go? Elena hesitated at the doorway, torn between the instinct to walk past him and the small, stubborn hope she had not fully extinguished, the hope that maybe last night had actually meant something to him. She sat down across from him, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. I've been thinking about what you said, Damien began, choosing his words carefully, the way he chose words in negotiations where every syllable mattered. About me not being present. About feeling like a stranger in your own house. And? Elena asked, her voice guarded. And I think you're right, he said. I think I let the company become an excuse to avoid things I didn't know how to face. Elena studied him for a long moment, waiting for the sentence that usually followed statements like this, the qualification, the justification, the reason it was not really his fault. It did not come. He simply sat there, holding her gaze, looking more uncertain than she had ever seen him look in 3 years of marriage. "What things?" she asked quietly. Damien opened his mouth, then closed it again. He was not used to explaining himself, not used to looking inward for answers, instead of outward for solutions. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I want to figure it out. I don't want you talking to a lawyer, Elena. I want another chance." The words hung between them, fragile and unfamiliar, coming from a man who had spent his entire adult life avoiding vulnerability, like it was a weakness that could be exploited by competitors. Elena felt something soften in her chest, despite every instinct telling her to protect herself from being disappointed again. "Words are easy, Damien," she said finally. "You've always been good with words when it mattered enough to you. I need to see something different, not just hear it." "Then I'll show you," he said, and there was a determination in his voice that she had not heard, directed at their marriage, in a very long time. He usually reserved that tone for boardrooms and negotiations, for moments when he had already decided he would not lose. She did not fully believe him yet. 3 years of quiet disappointment did not disappear over 1 cup of coffee and a handful of honest words. But something had shifted in the room, some small crack of possibility she had not expected to find there that morning. Damien left for work that day and, for the first time in longer than his assistant could recall, left by 6 in the evening instead of staying until nearly midnight. His assistant, a sharp and observant woman named Priya, noted the change with quiet curiosity, but said nothing, simply rescheduling the evening call he usually took from his office to the following morning instead. Over the following days, small changes began to appear, each one modest on its own, but significant in accumulation. Damien started asking Elena about her day and actually listening to the answers, sometimes asking follow-up questions that showed he remembered details from previous conversations. He canceled a business dinner to attend a small gallery opening where one of Elena's close friends was showing her paintings, standing quietly beside his wife as she introduced him to people whose names he actually made an effort to remember. Elena noticed, though she remained cautious, unwilling to let herself hope too quickly, after years of disappointment, had taught her caution as a form of self-protection. She watched him carefully, searching for signs that this was temporary, a reaction to fear rather than a genuine change, the kind of effort that would fade once the initial scare wore off. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after the gala, Damien came home to find Elena in the study, going through old photographs from a box she had pulled down from a closet shelf. He paused in the doorway, watching her sort through images of their wedding day, of early trips they had taken together, before the company had swallowed most of his time. "Can I sit?" he asked. She glanced up, surprised by the request, and nodded, sliding over slightly to make room on the small couch. He sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and looked down at the photograph in her hands, a picture from their honeymoon in the mountains, both of them laughing at something the photographer had said, sunlight bright on their faces. "I remember that day," Damien said quietly. "You made me hike up that ridge before sunrise because you wanted to see the light hit the peaks." "You complained the entire way up," Elena said, a small smile tugging at her lips despite herself. "I complained, but I would do it again," he said. "I would do a lot of things again, if I could go back and choose differently." Elena set the photograph down carefully, studying his profile in the lamplight. "Why didn't you? Choose differently, I mean. What changed after we got married?" Damien was quiet for a long moment, considering the question honestly, instead of deflecting it the way he usually did. "I think I was afraid," he finally said. "Not of you, of failing at this, the way my father failed at it. My parents' marriage was cold, Elena. I grew up watching 2 people share a house, without ever really sharing a life. I think somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that if I focused everything on the company, on providing, on succeeding, I could avoid becoming him. I didn't realize that by doing that, I was becoming exactly what I was trying to avoid." It was the most he had ever told her about his childhood, about the quiet, distant household he rarely spoke of, and Elena felt the weight of the confession settle between them, heavier and more honest than anything he had offered her in years. "You never told me that before," she said softly. "I never told anyone that before," he admitted. They sat together in silence for a while. The photograph spread between them, and Elena felt, for the first time in a long while, like she was sitting beside the man she had married, rather than a polished, distant version of him, built for boardrooms and business dinners. But the fragile progress they were building was not without its complications. A week later, Elena ran into Julian again, this time by accident, at a coffee shop near her office. He greeted her warmly, and they ended up sitting together for nearly an hour, catching up on years of separate lives, laughing over shared memories of university projects and late nights in the studio. It was innocent, nothing more than old friends reconnecting, but when Elena mentioned it to Damien that evening, almost as an afterthought while describing her day, she watched something flicker across his face, quick and involuntary, before he composed himself again. "That's nice," he said, and his voice was carefully even, carefully controlled, but Elena had spent enough years reading his moods to recognize the tension underneath the words. "Damien, it was just coffee," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not upset." But he was, and they both knew it, and the old habit of avoidance nearly won out as he reached for his laptop, ready to bury the discomfort in work the way he always had. Elena watched him hesitate, his hand hovering over the closed lid, and something in his expression shifted, some internal battle playing out behind his eyes. He set the laptop back down. "I don't like it," he admitted instead, the words clearly costing him something to say. "I don't like the idea of you spending time with him, and I know that's not fair, because I have no right to dictate who you see, especially after everything I put you through. But I'm trying to be honest with you, the way you asked me to be." Elena studied him, surprised by the admission, surprised by how much easier it was to trust honesty, even uncomfortable honesty, than the careful silence he used to offer instead. "Why does it bother you so much?" she asked. "Because he makes you laugh the way I used to," Damien said quietly, "and I'm terrified that I waited too long to remember how to do that myself." The confession sat heavy in the room, raw in a way that neither of them was fully used to. Elena reached across the space between them and took his hand, the first time she had initiated contact like that in longer than either of them could remember, and Damien looked down at their joined hands, as though he could hardly believe it was real. "I'm not going anywhere, Damien," she said. "Not yet. But you need to understand something. I can't keep doing this if it's only going to last as long as fear keeps you motivated. I need to know this is real, that you actually want this, not just that you're afraid of losing it." "It's real," he said, and for the first time, she believed him, or at least believed that he believed it himself. Still, doubt lingered beneath the surface of their fragile reconciliation, a quiet undercurrent neither of them fully addressed. Elena continued seeing a small circle of friends who knew about the trouble in her marriage, confiding in Sophia during long phone calls where she tried to sort through her tangled feelings, uncertain whether the changes in Damien were the beginning of something lasting or simply the desperate performance of a man afraid of consequences rather than genuinely transformed. Damien, for his part, began quietly researching therapists, something he had never considered before, uncomfortable with the idea of sitting across from a stranger and discussing his failures. He mentioned it to Elena almost sheepishly one night, watching her reaction carefully, as though testing whether the gesture would be seen as genuine effort or empty theater. "I think that's a good idea," Elena said, and there was warmth in her voice that had been absent for a long time. "For both of us, maybe. Not just you." They scheduled their first joint session for the following week, and though Damien dreaded it in a way he rarely dreaded anything, some quiet part of him recognized that avoiding discomfort was exactly the pattern that had brought them to this fragile point in the first place. But before that appointment arrived, an email landed in Damien's inbox that would complicate everything. A message from a rival company hinting at a hostile takeover attempt against Cole Enterprises. Timed, it seemed, to exploit a moment of vulnerability the sender clearly believed existed within the company's leadership. Damien stared at the message late into the night, the old instinct to bury himself entirely in the crisis warring against the fragile promises he had made to his wife only days before. He knew, staring at the screen, that the coming weeks would test every fragile change he had made, that the easy path back into old habits was only a few late nights away, and that if he chose the company over his marriage now, after everything he had just admitted to Elena, there might not be another chance to choose differently. He closed the laptop without responding to the email that night, a small act of resistance against everything his instincts told him to do, and went upstairs to bed, where Elena lay reading, and for once, simply sat beside her without reaching for his phone. It was a small choice, but it was a choice, and in the quiet of that bedroom, Damien understood that every day from now on would require him to keep making it. The therapist's office was small and quiet, with soft gray walls, and a window that looked out over a courtyard filled with autumn leaves. Damien sat stiffly on the couch, his hands clasped together, while Elena sat beside him, close enough that their knees nearly touched but not quite, a small physical distance that mirrored the emotional one still lingering between them. The therapist, a calm woman named Priya's cousin, Mira, introduced herself and asked them both a simple question to begin. "What brought you here today?" Damien answered first, surprising himself with how quickly the words came once he started speaking. He explained the years of distance, the late nights at the office, the slow erosion of intimacy that had crept into their marriage, so gradually neither of them had noticed, until it was nearly too late. He spoke about the gala, about hearing Elena mention a lawyer, about the fear that had gripped him in that moment, and had not fully released him since. Elena listened, surprised by his openness, by the absence of the careful, controlled language he usually used when discussing anything uncomfortable. When it was her turn to speak, she talked about the loneliness, about feeling like a placeholder in someone else's busy life rather than a partner in a shared one, about the exhaustion of trying to reach someone who seemed determined to stay just out of reach. The session was difficult, more difficult than either of them expected, filled with silences where old wounds surfaced and had to be examined rather than avoided. But by the end of the hour, something had shifted, some small foundation laid for the harder conversations still to come. Outside the office, standing on the sidewalk in the cool autumn air, Damien turned to Elena. "That was harder than any negotiation I've ever been in," he admitted. "Negotiations have clear rules," Elena said. "This doesn't." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." They walked to the car together, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, the silence between them felt comfortable rather than strained, a shared exhaustion rather than a shared distance. But the fragile peace they had built was about to face its first real test. 2 days after the therapy session, Damien received a phone call from his board, informing him that the rival company hinting at a hostile takeover had made their intentions public, filing paperwork that signaled a serious and immediate threat to Cole Enterprises. The company, Halbrook Industries, had been circling for months, and its founder, a sharp and aggressive businessman named Victor Halbrook, had apparently decided that Damien's recent distraction, though invisible to the public, had created an opening worth exploiting. Damien spent the entire day in emergency meetings, his phone ringing constantly, his calendar filling with calls that stretched late into the evening. He texted Elena twice to explain he would be late, each message shorter than the last, old habits creeping back in under the pressure of crisis. When he finally arrived home, well past midnight, he found the house dark and quiet, Elena already asleep. He stood in the doorway of their bedroom for a long moment, watching her sleep, feeling the familiar guilt of old patterns reasserting themselves despite every promise he had made only days before. The following morning, exhausted and tense, he explained the situation to Elena over a rushed breakfast, apologizing for the late night, promising it was temporary, that once the immediate threat was handled, things would return to the balance they had been building. Elena listened, her expression carefully neutral, and Damien could see her testing his words against the pattern of years past, weighing whether this was truly a temporary crisis or the beginning of the same slow retreat that had defined their marriage before. "I understand that this is serious," she said finally. "I'm not asking you to ignore a real threat to your company, but I need you to understand something too. If this becomes an excuse to disappear again, even for good reasons, I won't be able to trust that anything has actually changed." "I hear you," Damien said. "I'll find a way to handle both." It was easier said than done. Over the following 2 weeks, the situation with Halbrook Industries escalated rapidly. Victor Halbrook had been quietly acquiring shares of Cole Enterprises through intermediary companies, building a position significant enough to threaten Damien's control of the board. Damien found himself pulled into an intense strategic battle, working with lawyers and financial advisors late into the night, trying to identify allies among the shareholders and shore up support before Halbrook could force a vote that might strip Damien of his position entirely. The pressure was immense, unlike anything Damien had faced in his 12 years running the company, and the old instinct to disappear entirely into work, to let everything else fade into background noise, pulled at him constantly. But he found himself resisting it in small ways, coming home even on the hardest nights, if only for an hour, sitting with Elena at the kitchen table and talking through the day's events, letting her see the parts of the battle he would once have kept entirely hidden. "Why are you telling me all this?" Elena asked one evening, genuinely curious, as Damien explained the latest maneuver from Halbrook's legal team, sketching out share percentages on a napkin between them. "Because I used to think protecting you meant keeping you separate from all of this," Damien said. "I think I was wrong. I think keeping you separate just meant keeping you out." Elena studied the napkin, tracing the numbers with her finger, and then looked up at him with an expression he had not seen in years, something that looked almost like the admiration she used to hold for him before the distance crept in. "You could use my help, you know," she said. "I'm not just decoration at your business dinners, Damien. I have a business degree. I understand shareholder dynamics better than most people you have in that boardroom." It was true, and Damien realized, with a small jolt of shame, that he had spent years overlooking one of the sharpest minds available to him, simply because he had categorized his wife as a part of his personal life, rather than someone capable of standing beside him professionally as well. "Show me," he said, sliding the napkin toward her. Over the following days, Elena became quietly involved in the strategy sessions, her insights sharp and often more perceptive than the expensive consultants Damien had hired. She noticed patterns in Halbrook's acquisition strategy that the lawyers had missed, identified 2 board members whose loyalty was wavering before anyone else had picked up on it, and suggested an approach to secure a crucial swing vote that ultimately proved decisive. Working together against a shared external threat did something neither therapy session nor quiet conversation had fully managed to do. It reminded them both of why they had once been drawn to each other in the first place, before the marriage settled into routine and distance, back when they were 2 sharp, capable people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company and respected each other's minds. Late one night, after a particularly grueling session mapping out the final vote count needed to secure the board, Elena leaned back in her chair, rubbing her tired eyes, and Damien found himself simply watching her, struck by how much he had missed this. Missed her. Missed the partnership they had once shared before he let it erode. "What?" Elena asked, noticing his gaze. "Nothing," he said. "I just forgot how good it feels to actually work with you, instead of just existing near you." Elena smiled, tired but genuine. "I forgot too," she admitted. The moment lingered between them, soft and unguarded, and for the first time in the entire crisis, Damien allowed himself to feel something other than fear or exhaustion. He felt hope. The final board vote was scheduled for a Thursday morning, and the days leading up to it were tense, filled with last-minute calls and careful negotiations to secure every possible vote. Victor Halbrook made a final attempt to sway 2 undecided board members with an aggressive private offer, but Elena's earlier work in building relationships with those same members paid off, and both ultimately sided with Damien. When the vote finally concluded, Cole Enterprises retained its leadership structure, Halbrook's takeover attempt defeated by a comfortable margin. The relief that swept through the boardroom was palpable, and Damien, standing at the head of the table, found his eyes searching the room for Elena, who had come to observe the vote despite not officially being part of the company's leadership. She met his gaze across the room, and the look they shared said more than words could have managed. They had fought this battle together, and for the first time in a very long while, Damien understood what it meant to have a true partner standing beside him, rather than simply a spouse existing in the same house. That evening, they celebrated quietly at home, no elaborate dinner or grand gesture, just the 2 of them sitting on the back porch with a bottle of wine, watching the last of the daylight fade over the garden. "We make a good team," Elena said, swirling her glass. "We always did," Damien said. "I just forgot to notice." Elena set her glass down and looked at him seriously. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to actually hear it, not just listen politely." Damien straightened, giving her his full attention. "I'm listening." "The last few weeks have been good," Elena said carefully. "Really good, honestly. Better than I expected them to be. But I'm still scared, Damien. I'm scared that once this crisis passes, once things at the company settle back into normal, you'll drift again, the way you always have before. I need to know that what we're building isn't dependent on there being a threat forcing us together." Damien considered her words carefully, understanding the weight behind them, the years of disappointment that made this fear entirely reasonable. "I can't promise you I won't make mistakes," he said honestly. "I'm still learning how to be the kind of husband you deserve, but I can promise you that I'm not doing this because of Halbrook, or because I'm scared of losing face. I'm doing this because somewhere in the last few weeks, I remembered why I fell in love with you in the first place, and I don't want to lose that again." Elena studied his face in the fading light, searching for any hint of performance, any sign that his words were simply what he thought she wanted to hear. She found none, only quiet sincerity, the kind of honesty that had been notably absent from their marriage for far too long. "Okay," she said softly, "I want to believe you." "Then let me prove it," Damien said. "Not with words, with time." Elena nodded, and for the first time since the gala weeks earlier, she allowed herself to feel something close to genuine hope for their future, though the fear lingered quietly beneath the surface, a small voice reminding her that hope, once broken, was never quite as easy to trust again. Neither of them knew yet that the hardest test of their fragile progress was still to come, one that would arrive not from a rival company or an outside threat, but from within their own marriage, forcing both of them to confront the deepest wounds they had spent years avoiding. 3 weeks passed, and the crisis with Halbrook Industries faded into the background of daily business, replaced by the usual rhythm of quarterly reports and routine negotiations. Damien returned to his regular schedule, though he tried, at first, to hold on to the changes he had made during the crisis, coming home at reasonable hours, checking in with Elena throughout the day, keeping the promises he had made on the back porch that evening. But old patterns had a way of reasserting themselves quietly, one small compromise at a time, each one seeming reasonable in isolation. A meeting ran late, and he texted Elena he would be home in an hour instead of joining her for dinner as planned. A client dinner extended into a second round of drinks, and he arrived home well after she had already gone to sleep. None of it felt, in the moment, like a betrayal of his promises. Each instance seemed like a small, understandable exception, the kind of thing that happened in any demanding career. Elena noticed, of course, the way she always noticed, but she said nothing at first, telling herself she was being paranoid, that one late night did not undo weeks of genuine progress. She reminded herself of the therapy session, of the conversations on the porch, of the partnership they had rebuilt during the Halbrook crisis, and she tried to give him the benefit of the doubt that he had earned. The breaking point arrived on an evening that should have been simple. It was their wedding anniversary, 3 years since they had stood in front of family and friends, and promised each other a lifetime together. Elena had planned a quiet dinner at home, nothing extravagant, just the two of them, candles on the table, a meal she had spent the afternoon preparing herself, instead of hiring a caterer, wanting the evening to feel personal, rather than performative. Damien had promised, days earlier, that he would leave the office by 6 to be home in time. 6 o'clock came and went. Elena checked her phone, expecting a text explaining a delay, but found nothing. 7 o'clock arrived, the candles burning lower, the food growing cold on the stove. She texted him, a simple question mark, and received no immediate response. By 8 o'clock, Elena sat alone at the table she had set so carefully that morning, staring at 2 place settings, one of them empty, the candles nearly burned down to nothing. She felt something inside her go quiet and cold, a familiar, exhausted feeling she recognized from years of similar evenings she had thought were behind them. Damien finally arrived home at 9:30, his tie loosened, his expression distracted, already halfway through an apology before he even reached the kitchen doorway. "I'm sorry, the Meridian deal hit a snag, and I had to be on a call with the legal team. I completely lost track of time. I should have texted you." He stopped mid-sentence when he saw the table, the melted candles, the cold food, and Elena sitting there in the dress she had bought specifically for the evening, her expression carefully blank in a way that told him, more clearly than any words could have, exactly how much damage had just been done. "Elena, I'm so sorry," he said again, moving toward the table. Don't, she said quietly, and something in her voice stopped him where he stood. Don't apologize again, Damien. I've heard that apology so many times over the years that it doesn't mean anything to me anymore. This was different, he said. The deal genuinely required. I don't care about the deal, Elena said, her voice rising now, years of suppressed frustration finally breaking through the careful calm she had maintained for weeks. I don't care if it was a genuine emergency or not. That's not the point, Damien. The point is that you promised me, on the porch, with the wine, with all those careful words about how you had remembered why you fell in love with me, and it took less than a month for you to forget again. That's not fair, Damien said, though even as he said it, he could hear how weak the words sounded. Isn't it? Elena stood up from the table, her hands trembling slightly. I gave you the benefit of the doubt every single time these last few weeks, Damien. Every late meeting, every missed dinner, I told myself it was reasonable, that I was being paranoid, that things were still good underneath the small slips. But tonight was our anniversary. If there was ever a night you were going to remember to be present, it should have been tonight, and you weren't. You weren't even here to send a text. Damien had no response, because everything she said was true, and he knew it, standing there in the dim kitchen light, looking at the wreckage of an evening he had genuinely not meant to ruin, but had ruined all the same. I need space, Elena said finally, her voice quieter now, but no less resolute. I think I need to stay with Sophia for a while. Elena, please. This isn't a punishment, Damien, she said, cutting him off gently, but firmly. I'm not trying to hurt you. I just need time to think clearly, and I can't do that while I'm sitting in this house every night wondering if tonight is the night things go back to the way they were before. I need to see if you can actually sustain this, and I think I need distance to see it clearly, without hope clouding my judgment. She went upstairs to pack a bag, while Damien stood frozen in the kitchen, staring at the extinguished candles, the cold plates, the ruined dinner she had spent the afternoon preparing with her own hands. He wanted to follow her upstairs, wanted to argue, wanted to find some clever solution, the way he found solutions to every other problem in his life. But some part of him, quieter and more honest than usual, understood that this was not a problem that could be solved with clever words or grand gestures. This was a wound that required something he was still learning how to give consistently, and pushing against her need for space now would only prove her fears correct. 20 minutes later, Elena came back downstairs with a small suitcase, her coat already on. Damien met her at the door, his chest tight with a fear he had not felt this intensely, even during the depths of the Halbrook crisis. How long? He asked quietly. I don't know, Elena said honestly. I need you to understand that this isn't me giving up on us. I'm not going to a lawyer, Damien, at least not yet, but I need to see, from a distance, whether the man on the porch was real, or whether he was just a reaction to fear that fades once the fear passes. Damien nodded, though every instinct in him screamed to ask her to stay, to promise anything, everything, if only she would remain in the house with him. But he had learned enough, in the weeks of therapy and hard conversation, to recognize that this moment required restraint rather than desperation. I love you, he said instead. I know I haven't shown it well enough, but I do. Elena's eyes glistened, though she did not let the tears fall. I know you believe that, she said softly. I'm just not sure belief is enough anymore. I need to see it, consistently, without a crisis forcing your hand. She left then, the door closing quietly behind her, and Damien stood alone in the hallway of a house that suddenly felt enormous and empty, listening to the sound of her car pulling out of the driveway, the sound fading into silence. He did not sleep that night. He sat in the study long after midnight, staring at the same photographs Elena had pulled from the closet weeks earlier, the wedding day photos, the honeymoon in the mountains, the early years before the distance crept in. He thought about his father, about the cold, silent household he had grown up in, about the promise he had made himself as a young man, never to become that kind of husband, and the bitter irony that he had become exactly that anyway, despite every intention to the contrary. The following days were the loneliest Damien had experienced in years. He went to work, handled meetings with the same outward composure he always maintained, but the house he returned to each evening felt hollow, every room a reminder of Elena's absence. He found himself reaching for his phone constantly, drafting messages he did not send, unsure whether reaching out would feel like support or pressure, uncertain, for the first time in his career, of the correct move to make. Priya, his assistant, noticed the change immediately, the distracted pauses during meetings, the way he stared out his office window for long stretches, instead of working through his usual efficient pace. She said nothing directly, but she began quietly rearranging his schedule to give him more breathing room, canceling non-essential meetings without being asked. A small kindness that Damien noticed, but did not have the energy to properly acknowledge. A week into Elena's absence, Damien finally called Sophia, not to ask her to intervene on his behalf, but simply to ask how Elena was doing, needing some small connection to her even if indirect. "She's doing okay," Sophia said carefully. "She's thinking a lot. I don't know what conclusion she's reaching, Damien, and honestly, even if I did, it's not my place to tell you." "I understand," Damien said. "I just needed to know she was safe." "She's safe," Sophia confirmed. "She's just hurting." "You hurt her for a long time, Damien, and a few good weeks, even genuinely good weeks. Don't erase years of feeling invisible. I know you probably don't want to hear that." "No," Damien admitted, "but I need to hear it anyway." The call ended, and Damien sat in his office long after Sophia hung up, absorbing the weight of her words. And he understood, with painful clarity, that rebuilding trust was not a single grand gesture, or even a string of good weeks. It was a long, patient process, one that required consistency over months, perhaps years, and he had no guarantee that Elena would be willing to wait through that process with him. 2 weeks into the separation, an unexpected complication arose. Damien learned, through a mutual acquaintance at a business event, that Julian Cross had reached out to Elena during her stay at her sister's house, offering to take her to dinner, framing it simply as an old friend checking in during a difficult time. Damien felt the old jealousy surge up immediately, sharp and unwelcome. But this time, instead of letting it curdle into anger or accusation, he forced himself to sit with the feeling and examine it honestly. He realized, sitting alone in his study that evening, that his jealousy toward Julian had never really been about Julian at all. It was about his own failure, about watching someone else offer Elena the simple presence and attentiveness that Damien himself had withheld for years. Julian was not the threat. Damien's own absence was the threat, and it had been the threat long before Julian ever re-entered Elena's life. The realization did not make the fear disappear, but it clarified something important. If Damien wanted to save his marriage, the answer was not to eliminate every other man who might make Elena laugh or feel valued. The answer was to become, himself, the kind of husband capable of offering those same things, consistently, without needing a crisis or a rival to remind him. He picked up his phone that night, and, instead of a message asking Elena to come home, he wrote something different, something he hoped would communicate the shift happening inside him. "I'm not going to ask you to come back yet," he wrote. "I know you need time, and I respect that, even though it's the hardest thing I've ever had to respect. I just want you to know that I'm not waiting for you to fix this. I'm working on becoming someone worth coming back to, whether or not that's what eventually happens. I love you, and I'm not giving up, even if giving you space right now means giving up the thing I want most, which is you, here, tonight." He sent the message and set the phone down, uncertain whether she would respond at all. 10 minutes passed, then 20, and Damien had nearly given up on any reply that night, when his phone buzzed once, quietly, on the desk beside him. "Thank you for saying that," the message read. "I needed to hear it." It was not an invitation to return. It was not a promise of anything more. But it was something, a small thread of connection across the distance she had asked for, and Damien held on to it that night like a man clinging to the only solid ground he could find, in an otherwise uncertain landscape. The weeks that followed settled into a strange rhythm neither Damien nor Elena had experienced before. A marriage suspended in careful, deliberate distance. They spoke occasionally, brief phone calls that started stiff, and gradually grew a little easier each time, though neither of them rushed toward resolution. Damien resisted every urge to push for more, understanding now, in a way he had not before, that pressure would only confirm every fear Elena carried about his intentions. Instead, he turned his attention toward the parts of himself he had spent years avoiding. He began seeing Mira, the therapist, on his own, twice a week instead of the single joint session he and Elena had attended together. The individual sessions were uncomfortable, in ways the joint session had not been, forcing him to examine patterns stretching back far before his marriage, back into a childhood he rarely allowed himself to think about. "Tell me about your father," Mira said during one session, and Damien felt the familiar instinct to deflect, to offer a brief, controlled summary, and move the conversation elsewhere. But he had promised himself, walking into these sessions, that he would actually try, rather than simply performing effort, the way he had performed so many other things in his life. "My father built Cole Enterprises from almost nothing," Damien said slowly. "He was brilliant and ruthless, and he taught me everything I know about business. He also barely spoke to my mother for the last 15 years of their marriage. They stayed together because divorce would have looked bad for the company, not because either of them wanted to be there." "What did you learn from watching that?" Mira asked. Damien considered the question carefully. "I think I learned that love was optional, but success wasn't. That you could build an entire life around achievement and let everything else become secondary, and somehow that would still count as a life well lived." "Did it look like a life well lived, watching your parents?" Damien was quiet for a long moment. "No," he admitted finally. "It looked lonely. It looked like two people trapped in the same house, neither one brave enough to leave, both of them slowly disappearing into their own separate silences." "And is that what you were building with Elena?" The question landed hard, uncomfortably close to a truth Damien had spent years avoiding. "I think so," he said quietly. "I think I was so afraid of becoming my father in the obvious ways, the coldness, the distance, that I didn't notice I was becoming him anyway, just through a different door. I told myself that as long as I provided well, as long as I never raised my voice, never treated her poorly, I was doing better than he did. I didn't realize that simply not being cruel isn't the same as being present." Mira nodded slowly, letting the realization settle. "That's an important distinction," she said. "A lot of people believe that avoiding their parents' worst mistakes automatically makes them a good partner. But presence requires more than just avoiding harm. It requires active effort, attention, vulnerability. Those are different muscles entirely." Damien left that session feeling raw in a way he was not accustomed to, but also strangely lighter, as though naming the pattern had loosened its grip on him slightly. He began applying what he learned in small, deliberate ways, not aimed at winning Elena back through grand gestures, but aimed simply at becoming a different kind of man, whether or not she ever returned to him. He started leaving the office consistently by 6, even on days when no crisis demanded otherwise, training himself out of the old habit of using work as an escape from discomfort. He reconnected with a few old friends he had let drift away over the years of prioritizing the company above everything else, discovering, to his surprise, how much he had missed simple, undemanding companionship. He also, cautiously, reached out to his father, whom he had not spoken to at length in over a year, beyond brief obligatory calls around holidays. The conversation was stilted at first, his father clearly uncomfortable with anything resembling emotional honesty. But Damien pushed through the discomfort, asking questions he had never asked before. "Did you love Mom?" Damien asked during a walk they took together, one of the few times his father had agreed to leave the house for anything beyond business obligations. His father was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the gray autumn sky. "I think I did, once," he finally said. "I don't remember exactly when I stopped showing it. I don't think I decided to stop. I think I just got busy. And busy became the excuse, and by the time I noticed the distance, it felt too large to cross back over." "Do you regret it?" Damien asked. His father did not answer immediately, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight Damien had never heard in it before. "Every day," he said quietly. "I regret it, every single day, Damien. Don't make my mistake. If you still have a chance to cross that distance, take it, before it becomes too large." The conversation stayed with Damien for days afterward, a quiet confirmation of everything he had begun to understand through therapy, reinforced now by the regret of the very man who had shaped his understanding of marriage in the first place. Meanwhile, Elena's own process of reflection continued at Sophia's house, though her path forward remained far less certain than Damien's determination to change. She had dinner with Julian once during this period, a simple, friendly meal that Julian himself steered carefully away from anything resembling romantic intention, sensing, with the perceptiveness of an old friend, that Elena was not in a place to consider anything beyond her marriage, whatever direction that marriage ultimately took. "You still love him," Julian observed gently over dessert, watching Elena's expression as she spoke about Damien's recent efforts. "I do," Elena admitted. "That's part of what makes this so hard. If I didn't love him anymore, this would be simple. I could just leave, cleanly, without all this uncertainty. But I do love him, and I think, for the first time in years, he might actually be trying to become someone worth loving in return, not just someone I love out of habit or obligation." "Then what's stopping you from going home?" Julian asked. Elena considered the question carefully. "Fear, I think. I've hoped before, Julian. I hoped after the wedding that things would settle into something warmer, once the initial pressures of merging our lives passed. I hoped after our first anniversary that maybe he was finally slowing down. Every time, the hope faded, and I was left feeling more foolish and more alone than before. I don't know if I can survive hoping again, only to be disappointed a third time." "That's fair," Julian said. "But from what you've described, this seems different. Not perfect, but different. Maybe the question isn't whether you can survive being disappointed again. Maybe the question is whether you can survive never finding out." The words stayed with Elena long after their dinner ended, echoing in her mind during the quiet evenings at Sophia's house, during the long walks she took alone to clear her head, during the moments she found herself, almost involuntarily, checking her phone to see if Damien had texted, and feeling something warm settle in her chest when he had, even with messages that asked nothing of her beyond simple, honest updates about his day. Nearly a month into the separation, Damien organized something he hoped would communicate his changed understanding, without pressuring Elena toward any particular decision. He arranged, quietly, to have his father's old business partner, a semi-retired man named Gerald who had known Damien since childhood, meet with Elena for coffee, not to advocate on Damien's behalf, but simply to offer Elena a perspective on the changes he had witnessed in Damien over recent weeks. Changes visible, even to longtime colleagues who had known Damien his entire career. "I've worked with that man's father for 30 years, Gerald told Elena over coffee, unprompted, simply sharing an observation, rather than delivering a message. "I've watched Damien grow up in that world, learn every hard lesson his father taught him about business, and almost none of the lessons his father never learned about life. The man I had lunch with last week is different from the man I knew even 6 months ago. I don't say that lightly. I've watched him for 30 years. Elena did not respond to Gerald with any commitment, but she carried his words with her, another small piece of evidence in the careful, cautious accounting she had been keeping since the night she left, weighing each piece against her fear, trying to determine whether the risk of hoping again was worth the possibility of finally being met by the partner she had always wanted Damien to become. 5 weeks after she had walked out the door with a small suitcase and an uncertain future, Elena called Damien one evening, her voice quieter and more thoughtful than it had been in any of their previous calls. "I think we should talk," she said. "In person. Properly." Damien's heart pounded in his chest. Hope and fear tangled together so tightly he could barely distinguish between them. "Whenever you're ready," he said. "I'll be here." "Tomorrow evening," Elena said. "Not at the house. Somewhere neutral, I think, would be easier for both of us." They agreed to meet at a quiet restaurant neither of them had frequented before, a place without the weight of shared memories attached to it, neutral ground for what both of them understood would be one of the most important conversations of their marriage. That night, after the call ended, Damien sat alone in the study, staring at the photographs still spread across the small table from weeks earlier, and felt, for the first time since Elena had left, a fragile, cautious hope beginning to take root, though he understood, with the clarity therapy had given him, that hope alone would not be enough. Tomorrow, he would need to show her, honestly and completely, exactly who he had become in her absence, and trust that it would be enough to finally close the distance that had grown between them, over years he could not get back, but might still, if he was fortunate, find a way to make up for going forward. The restaurant was small, tucked into a quiet street away from the busier parts of the city, the kind of place with soft lighting and enough space between tables that conversations could remain private. Damien arrived early, choosing a table near the back, away from the window, and spent the 15 minutes before Elena arrived rehearsing words he knew he would abandon the moment she actually sat down across from him. She arrived exactly on time, dressed simply, her expression composed but not cold, and Damien stood as she approached the table, an old habit of formality that felt, for once, entirely appropriate rather than performative. "Thank you for coming," he said, pulling out her chair before catching himself, unsure whether the gesture would feel welcome or overly formal, given the circumstances. "Thank you for suggesting somewhere neutral," Elena said, settling into her seat. "I think I needed that." They ordered quickly, neither particularly hungry, both aware that the food was simply a formality around the conversation they had actually come to have. For a few minutes, they exchanged small updates, careful and polite, the kind of surface conversation that filled the space, before either of them was ready to address what actually mattered. Finally, Elena set down her water glass and looked at him directly. "I've spent the last 5 weeks thinking about very little besides us," she said. "About whether I can trust the changes I've seen, about whether they're sustainable, about whether I'm foolish for even considering giving this another chance." "And what have you concluded?" Damien asked, his voice steadier than he felt. "I don't know yet," Elena admitted honestly. "That's actually why I wanted to talk to you in person. I have questions, Damien, real questions, and I need honest answers, not the kind of careful, strategic answers you give in a boardroom." "Ask me anything," Damien said. "I promise you honesty." Elena took a breath, gathering herself. "Why now?" she asked. "We've been married 3 years. You've had 3 years to become this version of yourself, and instead, I got a version who barely looked up from his phone during dinner. What changed? Was it really just fear of losing me, or is there something deeper you've actually worked through?" Damien considered the question carefully, understanding that his answer would shape everything that followed. "Both, honestly," he said. "The fear was the spark. I won't pretend otherwise. Hearing you say those words to Sophia terrified me in a way nothing else in my life ever has. But fear alone wouldn't have sustained 5 weeks of therapy, of hard conversations with my own father, of genuinely examining why I became the man I became. The fear opened a door I had kept locked for years. What's happened since then, the actual change, that's come from walking through that door and doing the work on the other side of it." "Tell me about the door," Elena said quietly. "Tell me what you found." Damien told her, then, about the sessions with Mira, about the painful recognition of his father's pattern living inside him despite his best efforts to avoid it. He told her about the walk with his father, about the quiet admission of regret that had stayed with him ever since. He spoke honestly, without the careful polish he usually applied to difficult conversations, and Elena listened, watching his face for any sign of performance, finding instead only raw, unguarded honesty. "I used to think that not being cruel was enough," Damien said. "I thought as long as I never raised my voice, never treated you poorly, never did anything obviously wrong, I was succeeding as a husband. I didn't understand that simply avoiding harm isn't the same as offering presence. I was absent, Elena, for years, and I called that absence peace, because there weren't any obvious fights to point to. I understand now that the absence itself was the wound, even without a single argument to mark it." Elena's eyes glistened, and this time she let the tears fall, quiet and unguarded. "That's exactly it," she said softly. "That's exactly what I could never explain properly, even to myself. Everyone would ask me why I was unhappy when you never mistreated me, when I had every material comfort, when you never raised your voice. I couldn't explain that the silence itself was the mistreatment, that being invisible hurt just as much as being harmed, maybe more, because at least harm gets acknowledged. Invisibility just gets normalized." "I'm sorry," Damien said, the words simple, but weighted with everything he had learned in the weeks since she left. Not the kind of sorry I've said 100 times before, the reflexive kind, meant to smooth over an argument. "I'm sorry for the years, Elena, for building a life that looked successful from the outside, while leaving you alone inside it." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his words settling between them, and Elena reached across the table, taking his hand the way she had once before, weeks earlier, in a moment that had felt fragile and uncertain then, and felt, somehow, more solid now. "I'm not ready to move back in yet," she said carefully, and Damien felt his chest tighten, though he kept his expression steady, understanding that pushing against this boundary would only confirm every doubt she still carried. But I want to keep talking. I want to keep going to therapy together. I want to see if this is something we can actually rebuild, slowly, without rushing back into old patterns just because it's comfortable. I can do that, Damien said. Whatever pace you need, I'll match it. There's something else, Elena said, her expression turning more serious. Julian mentioned something to me a few weeks ago, and I think you should hear it directly from me rather than through rumor or assumption. Damien felt the old jealousy flicker, but he forced himself to remain calm, to listen rather than react. He asked me to dinner once, during the separation, Elena continued. It was innocent, just two old friends catching up, and he made it very clear, without me even needing to ask, that he wasn't interested in anything beyond friendship, especially not while I was working through something as serious as my marriage. I want you to know that, because I don't want secrets between us anymore, even small ones. Damien absorbed the information carefully, and to his own surprise, felt something closer to gratitude than jealousy. Thank you for telling me, he said. I won't pretend the idea of you having dinner with him doesn't bother me, somewhere underneath everything else. But I trust you, Elena, and more than that, I understand now that the real threat was never Julian. It was always my own absence. If I keep showing up, consistently, the way I'm trying to now, that fear won't have room to grow the way it used to. Elena smiled, small but genuine, the kind of smile Damien had not seen directed at him in longer than he wanted to admit. That's a healthier way to think about it than I expected from you, she said. Therapy, Damien said, allowing himself a small, wry smile of his own. Turns out it's useful for more than just managing hostile takeovers. Elena laughed, a real laugh, and the sound of it, directed at him, in this quiet restaurant, felt like something Damien would carry with him for the rest of his life. A small victory, after weeks of uncertain waiting. They talked for nearly 2 more hours, longer than either of them had expected, covering ground they had avoided for years, old resentments finally spoken aloud, and met with understanding, rather than defensiveness, small hopes for the future, carefully shared between two people, learning, slowly, how to trust each other again. By the time they left the restaurant, standing together on the quiet street outside, neither of them was ready to declare the marriage fully repaired, but something had undeniably shifted, a foundation laid that felt sturdier than anything they had built in the 3 years prior. Same time next week? Damien asked, standing beside his car, reluctant to end the evening. I'd like that, Elena said. And Damien, thank you, for being honest tonight. It meant more than you probably realize. I meant every word, he said. She hesitated for a moment, then leaned forward and hugged him, brief but genuine, the first physical affection they had shared since the night of the anniversary dinner weeks earlier. Damien held on to the moment, careful not to hold too tightly, understanding that trust rebuilt slowly required patience even in its smallest gestures. Driving home alone that night, back to a house that still felt too large and too empty without her, Damien allowed himself, for the first time since she left, to believe that they might actually find their way back to each other, not through grand gestures or desperate promises, but through the slow, patient work of becoming someone worth trusting again. He knew there would be more difficult conversations ahead, more tests of his consistency, more moments where old habits would tempt him back toward the comfortable distance he had relied on for years. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt equipped to face those moments differently, armed not with strategy or control, but with the harder, more honest tools of presence and vulnerability he had spent the last 5 weeks learning to use. Victor Halbrook did not disappear quietly after losing the board vote weeks earlier. Men like him rarely accepted defeat gracefully, and Damien should have known better than to assume the matter was fully settled simply because the immediate threat had passed. It was Priya who first alerted him to the new development, stepping into his office one morning with a folder held tightly against her chest and an expression that told him, before she said a single word, that the news would not be good. "There's an article," she said, setting the folder on his desk. "It's set to publish this afternoon, in the business section. Someone leaked information about the company's finances, but it's mixed with personal claims about you and Elena. I think it's an attempt to damage your credibility with the remaining shareholders before the next quarterly review." Damien opened the folder and read through the draft article, his stomach tightening with each paragraph. The financial claims were mostly exaggerated distortions of routine business decisions, the kind of thing his legal team could counter easily enough. But mixed among the exaggerations were personal details about his marriage, framed in a way that painted him as an unstable, distracted leader, whose personal life had bled into poor judgment at the company. Details that could only have come from someone close enough to know about the separation. How did they get this? Damien asked, though he suspected he already knew the likely source. Someone within Halbrook's orbit, who had connections to people in his own social circle. Gossip traveling through channels he had never bothered to guard carefully, because he had never imagined needing to. I don't know, Priya admitted, but I think you need to call Elena before this publishes. If reporters start reaching out to her directly, she deserves to hear about this from you first, not from a stranger asking invasive questions about her marriage. Damien called Elena immediately, his hands steadier than he expected given the circumstances, a testament, perhaps, to the weeks of practice he'd had recently, in facing difficult conversations directly, rather than avoiding them. There's an article about to publish, he explained, once she picked up. It includes some distorted claims about the company, but it also mentions our separation. I wanted you to hear it from me, before anyone else contacts you. Elena was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. How bad is it? She asked. Bad enough that reporters might try to reach you, Damien said honestly. I'll have our lawyers issue a statement about the financial claims, but I don't know how to protect you from questions about our marriage, without either confirming or denying details that are honestly nobody's business but ours. Let me think, Elena said. Can you come to Sophia's? I think we should decide how to handle this together, not separately. Damien arrived at Sophia's house within the hour, and Elena met him at the door, her expression tense but focused, the same sharp, strategic focus he remembered from the Halbrook crisis weeks earlier, when she had proven herself an invaluable partner in navigating the company's defense. They sat together at Sophia's kitchen table, the article draft spread between them, and worked through the situation methodically, the way they had learned to work together during the earlier crisis, each of them contributing pieces the other might have missed. We could deny the separation entirely, Damien suggested. Say it's simply gossip, unfounded. That feels dishonest, Elena said, shaking her head. And if anyone ever confirms it later, it would look worse, like we were hiding something shameful. I don't think our situation is shameful, Damien. Difficult, yes, but not something we need to lie about. Then what do you suggest? Elena considered the question carefully. What if we're simply honest, in a controlled way? A brief statement acknowledging that every marriage faces challenges, that we've been working through a difficult period privately, and that we'd appreciate our personal life being kept separate from the company's business matters. It doesn't give them the dramatic story they're hoping for, and it doesn't leave us vulnerable to being caught in an obvious lie later. Damien considered her suggestion, recognizing the wisdom in it immediately. That's smarter than anything my legal team would have come up with, he said. You should have been in that boardroom years ago. I offered, once, Elena said, a small wry note in her voice. You told me the company wasn't a place for spouses to get involved. Damien winced, recognizing the old mistake, another small piece of evidence in the pattern he was still working to dismantle. I was wrong about that too, apparently, he admitted. You were, Elena agreed, but there was no bitterness in her voice, only quiet acknowledgement, the kind of honest correction that had become easier between them in recent weeks, delivered without the sharp edges that once accompanied similar conversations before the separation. They drafted the statement together, careful and measured, and Damien sent it to his legal team, along with instructions to prepare a firm but professional response to the exaggerated financial claims. By the time the article published that afternoon, Cole Enterprises had already released its own statement, calm and controlled, effectively neutralizing much of the intended damage before it could fully take hold. The financial markets reacted mildly to the news, the stock dipping only slightly, before stabilizing within a day, as investors recognized the exaggerated claims for what they were. The personal details about the separation drew some attention from gossip columns, but the couple's measured, honest statement left little room for the kind of dramatic speculation Halbrook had clearly hoped to provoke. What surprised Damien most, in the aftermath, was how the crisis, rather than driving a wedge between them the way it might have months earlier, had instead brought them closer together, another shared battle fought side by side rather than separately. Working through the situation with Elena reminded him, once again, of exactly what he had been missing during the years he treated their marriage as something separate from the rest of his life, something to be managed in its own quiet corner, while the real challenges of his life happened elsewhere. That evening, after the immediate crisis had passed, Damien and Elena sat together on Sophia's back porch, the same kind of quiet evening they had once shared on their own porch weeks earlier, before everything had fallen apart around the missed anniversary dinner. "I want to say something," Elena said, watching the last light fade over the yard. "And I want you to actually hear it, the way you asked me to hear you at the restaurant." "I'm listening," Damien said. "Today reminded me of something," she said slowly. "It reminded me of the Halbrook crisis, of working together, of feeling like your partner instead of your accessory. I think that's what I actually want, Damien. More than grand romantic gestures or perfect anniversaries. I want to be someone you turn to when things get difficult, not someone you protect from difficulty by keeping me separate from it." "I understand that now," Damien said. "I think I understand it more clearly than I ever have." "I think I'm ready to come home," Elena said quietly, and Damien felt his chest tighten with a hope so large it nearly took his breath away. "Not because everything is perfect, and not because I've forgotten the reasons I left in the first place, but because I think, for the first time in a long while, I actually believe you're becoming the partner I always hoped you could be." Damien reached for her hand, and this time, she let him hold it without hesitation, the small gesture carrying the weight of weeks of careful, patient rebuilding. "I won't take that for granted," he said. "I promise you that." "I know you won't," Elena said. "I've watched you work hard for this, these last 5 weeks. I believe you." They sat together on the porch for a long while after that, not saying much, simply enjoying the quiet comfort of being near each other, without the tension that had characterized so much of their recent conversations. When Damien finally rose to leave, Elena walked him to his car, and this time, when they hugged goodbye, it lingered longer, more certain than the brief embrace outside the restaurant weeks earlier. "I'll help you pack this weekend," Damien offered. "If you're ready." "I'd like that," Elena said, smiling. "But Damien, I want to be clear about something. Coming home doesn't mean everything is instantly fixed. We still have work to do. Therapy continues. We keep having these honest conversations. I don't want us to slip back into old comfortable silence just because I'm back in the house." "I understand," Damien said. "I don't want that either. I've learned, these last 5 weeks, that comfortable silence was never actually comfortable at all. It just felt easier than doing the harder work of actually showing up." Elena smiled, and this time, the smile reached her eyes fully, unguarded in a way Damien had not seen since long before their troubles began. "Then I think we're finally on the same page," she said. Driving home that night, Damien felt something settle inside him, a quiet, hard-won peace he had not experienced in longer than he could remember. The road ahead would still require work, he understood that clearly. Trust, once broken, did not repair itself instantly, simply because both parties wanted it to. But for the first time since the gala weeks earlier, since the moment he had watched his wife laugh with another man, and felt the ground shift beneath him, Damien believed, genuinely, and without the desperate edge of fear driving the belief, that they would find their way back to each other, stronger, and more honest than they had ever been before. He did not yet know that the true test of everything he had learned was still waiting for him, one final challenge that would ask him to prove, in the most public and humbling way possible, exactly how far he was willing to go for the woman he had nearly lost. Elena moved back into the house on a Saturday morning, the process far less dramatic than either of them had anticipated. Sophia helped carry boxes, teasing her sister gently about how little she had actually taken with her during the separation, and Damien spent the morning rearranging the closet to make space, small physical gestures meant to communicate what words alone could not fully capture. The first few nights back felt strange, both of them adjusting to shared space again after weeks of separate routines, careful with each other in ways that were new, more intentional than the comfortable, unexamined patterns of their earlier marriage. They continued the joint therapy sessions with Mira, working through smaller frictions as they arose, rather than letting them accumulate silently the way old resentments once had. Damien maintained the boundaries he had set for himself during the separation, leaving the office by 6 most evenings, protecting weekends for the two of them whenever possible, treating these commitments not as temporary concessions, but as fundamental parts of who he was choosing to become. Elena, for her part, gradually let her guard down, allowing herself small moments of trust, though the old caution never fully disappeared, a quiet awareness in the back of her mind that continued monitoring whether the changes would hold. 3 weeks after Elena's return, Cole Enterprises hosted its annual shareholders gala, a significant event on the company calendar, one that Damien had, in years past, treated as purely a business obligation, attending alone, or with Elena serving only as a decorative presence beside him. This year, he approached the event differently, discussing the evening with Elena beforehand, asking for her input on strategy, the way he had learned to during the Halbrook crisis, treating the event as something they would navigate together, rather than something he would simply endure, while she stood quietly at his side. The gala itself unfolded smoothly for the first 2 hours, Damien moving through the crowd with practiced confidence, Elena beside him, genuinely engaged rather than simply performing engagement, occasionally offering sharp observations about various shareholders that Damien found himself relying on more than he expected. The trouble began when Victor Halbrook appeared, uninvited but technically permitted entry as a minority shareholder, still smarting from his defeated takeover attempt weeks earlier, and clearly looking for any opportunity to cause disruption. He approached Damien and Elena near the center of the ballroom, a thin, calculating smile on his face that immediately put Damien on guard. "Damien, Elena," Halbrook said smoothly. "I hear congratulations are in order. Reconciled, I understand. After your little separation. Must have been quite the ordeal, especially with young Julian Cross so conveniently available during the difficult weeks." The comment landed with deliberate precision, designed to embarrass, to provoke, to plant doubt in front of the assembled shareholders watching the exchange with poorly concealed curiosity. Elena felt her face flush, not with guilt, but with the humiliation of having something private weaponized in such a public setting. Damien felt the old instinct rise immediately, sharp and hot, the urge to respond with the same ruthless precision he applied to boardroom conflicts, to publicly dismantle Halbrook's credibility the way he had once dismantled every rival who dared challenge him. Weeks ago, that instinct would have won without question, and Damien would have delivered a cutting response, protecting his own image above all else, likely leaving Elena to manage the emotional fallout of being discussed like a piece of contested property, rather than a person. Instead, Damien did something different. He reached for Elena's hand, steady and deliberate, and looked at Halbrook with a calm that surprised even himself. "My marriage isn't a subject for boardroom gossip, Victor," Damien said, his voice even, controlled, but carrying none of the aggressive edge Halbrook clearly hoped to provoke. "Elena and I went through a difficult period, like many couples do, and we worked through it honestly, together. I'm not embarrassed by that, and I won't pretend otherwise, just because you're hoping to manufacture a scandal out of something that was actually one of the most important growth periods of my life." The response caught Halbrook off guard, clearly expecting either denial or aggressive counterattack, unprepared for calm, honest acknowledgement instead. Several nearby shareholders, who had been listening with obvious interest, seemed visibly impressed by the response, murmuring quietly among themselves. "As for Julian," Damien continued, turning slightly to include Elena more fully in the conversation, "he's an old friend of my wife's, who offered kindness during a hard time. Nothing more. I trust my wife completely, and frankly, Victor, I find it telling that you had to dig through personal gossip about my marriage, because you couldn't find anything legitimate to attack about how I run this company." A few soft chuckles rippled through the small crowd that had gathered, and Halbrook's confident expression faltered slightly, recognizing that his attempted humiliation had backfired, leaving him looking petty, rather than powerful, in front of an audience whose opinion mattered considerably to the company's ongoing stability. Elena squeezed Damien's hand, a small, grateful gesture, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same calm confidence Damien's had. "Julian is a wonderful friend," she said simply, "and Damien is a wonderful husband, difficult months and all. I'm not sure why either of those facts would interest you, Victor, but I appreciate you giving us the opportunity to clarify them so publicly. Saves us the trouble of correcting the rumors individually." Halbrook, recognizing the conversation had turned decisively against him, offered a stiff, insincere excuse about needing to greet other guests, and retreated into the crowd, leaving Damien and Elena standing together, the small circle of shareholders around them, offering approving nods and a few quiet words of support, before dispersing back into the larger party. "That was well handled," Elena said quietly, once they were alone again, her eyes bright with something that looked like genuine admiration. "We handled it," Damien corrected gently. "I couldn't have said any of that with the same confidence if I hadn't actually believed it, and I only believe it because of the work we've both put in these last weeks." Elena smiled, leaning slightly into him, a small physical closeness that felt entirely natural, rather than performed for the benefit of watching shareholders. "A month ago, you would have torn him apart with cold precision and left me standing there, feeling like a prop in your revenge," she said. "Tonight, you defended us, together, without losing yourself to anger. That's different, Damien. That's real." "I'm trying," Damien said. "Every day, I'm trying." The rest of the evening passed without further incident, Halbrook keeping his distance for the remainder of the gala, clearly unwilling to risk another public exchange that had gone so poorly for him. Damien and Elena moved through the remaining hours of the event with an ease neither of them had experienced at a company function in years, genuinely enjoying each other's company amid the usual obligations of networking and small talk. Later that night, driving home together, Elena reached over and took Damien's hand resting on the gear shift, holding it gently for the remainder of the drive. "I need to tell you something," she said, as they pulled into the driveway. "What is it?" Damien asked, turning off the engine, but not yet moving to leave the car. "Tonight, watching you defend us the way you did, I realized something," Elena said carefully. "I've spent weeks, honestly months, waiting to see if the changes I witnessed were real or temporary. Tonight, under real pressure, in front of people whose opinions actually matter to your career, you chose honesty and partnership over image and pride. I don't think you would have made that choice 6 months ago." "I know I wouldn't have," Damien admitted. "I think that's the proof I needed," Elena said softly. "Not the quiet moments at home, though those mattered too. I needed to see you choose differently when it actually cost you something, when the easy path was still available, and you chose the harder, more honest one instead." Damien turned to face her fully in the dim light of the car, understanding the weight of what she was telling him. "Does that mean what I think it means?" he asked carefully, not wanting to presume too much, still holding on to the caution that had defined their recent weeks together. Elena smiled, warm and genuine. "It means I trust you, Damien. Fully. Not cautiously anymore. It means I think we actually made it through, together, to the other side of whatever this was." The relief that flooded through Damien in that moment was unlike anything he had experienced in his entire career of successful negotiations and hard-won victories. This victory felt different, more meaningful, earned not through strategy or dominance, but through months of humbling, honest work that had asked more of him than any business deal ever had. He leaned across the small space between them and kissed her, softly, the kind of kiss that carried the weight of everything they had rebuilt over the difficult weeks since the gala, where this entire journey had begun. Elena kissed him back, her hand coming up to rest against his cheek, and for the first time since that terrible night watching her laugh with another man, Damien felt completely, unreservedly certain that his marriage, and the woman at the center of it, were exactly where they belonged. But even as they sat together in the quiet driveway, wrapped in the warmth of hard-won reconciliation, neither of them yet knew that Victor Halbrook, humiliated and vengeful after his public failure at the gala, was already planning one final, more dangerous move. One that would threaten not just Damien's pride, but everything they had worked so carefully to rebuild. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, sent not to Damien, but directly to Elena's personal account, and she read it twice before the meaning fully registered, her hands growing cold as she understood exactly what she was looking at. The message came from an anonymous account, the language calm and businesslike in a way that made it somehow more chilling. Attached were several photographs, digitally altered to suggest an intimacy between Elena and Julian that had never existed. Images cleverly manipulated from innocent moments captured during their public dinner weeks earlier, twisted through editing into something that told a very different, very false story. The message beneath the photographs was direct. Convince your husband to step down from his position at Cole Enterprises within the week, or these images, along with a fabricated narrative about the affair that caused your recent separation, would be sent to every major business publication in the city. Elena sat frozen at the kitchen table, staring at her phone, her breath coming fast and shallow. She recognized immediately, even through the fear, that this had Halbrook's fingerprints all over it, though the sender had been careful to route the message through channels that would be difficult to trace directly back to him. Damien found her there 20 minutes later, still staring at the phone, her face pale, and he crossed the kitchen quickly, kneeling beside her chair with an urgency that reminded her, even in her fear, of exactly how much he had changed over recent months. "What happened?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. Wordlessly, Elena handed him the phone, watching his expression shift from confusion to horror to a controlled, cold fury as he scrolled through the fabricated images and the threatening message beneath them. "This is Halbrook," Damien said, his voice low and dangerous, in a way Elena had rarely heard from him. "This has to be Halbrook." "I know," Elena said, her voice shaking slightly. "Damien, if this gets out, even though it's fake, people will believe it. It will look exactly like what he tried to suggest at the gala, except now with supposed proof." Damien set the phone down carefully and took both of Elena's hands in his, forcing himself to remain calm despite the fury building inside him, understanding that Elena needed steadiness from him in this moment, not the reflection of his own rage. "Listen to me," he said firmly. "I don't care what he threatens to publish. I know these images are fabricated because I know you, and I know Julian was never anything more than a friend, offering kindness during a difficult time. If Halbrook wants to publish lies, we will fight them with the truth, publicly and completely, and I will not let him use fear to control either of us." "But your position at the company," Elena started, "is not more important than you," Damien said firmly, cutting her off. "Elena, I spent years prioritizing this company over everything else in my life, including you, and I nearly lost everything that actually mattered because of it. I am not making that mistake again. Whatever Halbrook publishes, we will face it together, honestly, and if the board has a problem with a fabricated scandal, then that's a conversation I'm prepared to have directly with them." Elena studied his face, searching for any hesitation, any sign that his resolve might crack under real pressure, and found none. The certainty in his expression, the immediate, unwavering choice to protect her over protecting his own position, settled something deep and anxious inside her that she had not even fully realized she was still carrying. "What do we do?" she asked. "First, we call our lawyers," Damien said. "This is extortion, plain and simple, and it's illegal regardless of who sent it. Second, we get ahead of this ourselves, before Halbrook has the chance to release anything. I'd rather control the narrative honestly than let him control it through fabricated lies." Within the hour, Damien's legal team had been briefed on the situation, working quickly to trace the digital origins of the threatening email, while simultaneously preparing documentation to demonstrate, conclusively, that the images had been manipulated. Damien also reached out directly to a trusted contact at one of the city's most respected business publications, a journalist named Priya's brother, Farhan, who had covered Cole Enterprises fairly and accurately for years. "I want to get ahead of a fabricated story before it spreads," Damien explained over the phone, his voice steady despite the tension of the situation. "I'd rather you have the full, honest context directly from us than let this circulate through anonymous channels first." Farhan agreed to meet with them that same afternoon, and Damien and Elena sat together across from him at a quiet cafe, explaining the entire situation honestly, including the separation, the reasons behind it, the genuine reconciliation that had followed, and now the fabricated blackmail attempt clearly designed to derail both their marriage and Damien's position at the company. "This sounds like Halbrook's style," Farhan observed, reviewing the doctored images with a practiced, skeptical eye. "He tried something similar against a competitor 2 years ago, though it never made it to publication, because the target folded to his demands before it could." "We're not folding," Damien said firmly. "I'd rather the truth be public than let a lie control our lives." Farhan nodded slowly, clearly impressed by the direct, honest approach, so different from the defensive evasion he usually encountered when investigating potential scandals involving powerful businessmen. "I'll need to verify a few things independently," he said, "but I appreciate the transparency. Most people in your position would have tried to bury this quietly, rather than get ahead of it honestly. Over the following 2 days, while the investigation into the doctored images and their source continued, Damien and Elena faced the uncertainty together, a stark contrast to how Damien might have handled a similar crisis months earlier, when he would have retreated into work, managing the situation alone, while shutting Elena out of the details, to supposedly protect her from stress. Instead, they worked through the tension side by side, discussing strategy each evening, supporting each other through the anxious waiting, their partnership stronger for having weathered the Halbrook crisis and the anniversary conflict and the weeks of separation that had ultimately taught them both how to face difficulty honestly rather than separately. The break came on the 3rd day, when Damien's legal team successfully traced the origin of the blackmail email back to a private contractor who had, under careful questioning, admitted to being hired by an intermediary connected to Halbrook Industries. The evidence was sufficient not only to prove the extortion attempt conclusively, but also to open Halbrook himself to serious legal consequences, given the clear paper trail connecting the scheme back to his company's resources. Farhan's article, published shortly after the evidence came to light, told the full story honestly, detailing Halbrook's failed takeover attempt, his humiliation at the shareholders' gala, and his subsequent attempt to blackmail Damien and Elena using fabricated images, framing the couple not as victims of scandal, but as the targets of an increasingly desperate rival's failed manipulation. The article's honest, sympathetic framing, combined with the clear evidence against Halbrook, effectively destroyed any remaining credibility he held within the business community. And within weeks, Halbrook Industries announced his resignation from the company he had founded, the board no longer willing to associate themselves with his increasingly reckless behavior. For Damien and Elena, the resolution of the crisis marked something more significant than simply the defeat of a persistent rival. It marked the final test of everything they had worked to rebuild since that terrible night at the gala months earlier. And this time, facing genuine, serious threat, Damien had chosen Elena without hesitation, without calculation, without the old instinct to protect his position above all else. Sitting together on their porch the evening the article published, watching the last color fade from the sky, Elena turned to Damien with an expression of quiet, settled peace that he had not seen on her face since the earliest days of their marriage, before the distance had crept in and slowly eroded everything they once shared. "I don't have any doubts left," she said softly. "Not about you, not about us. I think we actually made it, Damien, through everything." Damien reached for her hand, holding it gently in the fading evening light, and felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, a peace that was not dependent on business success or careful strategy, but simply on the quiet, hard-won certainty of being truly known and truly chosen by the woman beside him. "There's something I want to do," he said quietly. "Something I've been thinking about for weeks, waiting for the right moment. I think, after everything, this might finally be it." Elena looked at him curiously, unsure what he meant, but trusting, completely now, whatever he had planned. 2 weeks after Halbrook's resignation made headlines across the business world, Damien asked Elena to join him for a walk through the botanical gardens where they had gone on their very first date, nearly 5 years earlier, back when their relationship had been new and uncomplicated, before business obligations and slow neglect had settled between them like a quiet fog. Elena agreed without question, curious about the growing anticipation she could sense in Damien throughout the day, though he offered no explanation, only a quiet, private smile whenever she asked what he was planning. They arrived at the gardens in the late afternoon, the autumn light golden and soft across the winding paths, the same paths they had walked together years earlier, back when Damien had been a younger, less guarded version of himself, before the pressures of the company had gradually taught him to build walls around every soft, vulnerable part of his character. "Do you remember this place?" Damien asked, as they walked past a small stone fountain surrounded by late-blooming flowers. "Of course," Elena said, smiling at the memory. "You got lost trying to find the exit and refused to admit it for nearly 20 minutes." "I was trying to impress you," Damien admitted, laughing softly. "I thought a confident man shouldn't ask for directions." "You were terrible at hiding it," Elena teased. "I could tell you had no idea where we were." They continued walking, reminiscing about those early months together, the ease and warmth between them, a stark contrast to the careful, guarded distance that had characterized so much of their recent history, before the difficult months of separation and rebuilding. Damien led them, eventually, toward a small clearing near the center of the gardens, a quiet space, surrounded by tall trees, just beginning to turn gold and red with the changing season. The exact spot, Elena realized with a soft gasp, where Damien had first told her he loved her, years earlier, on that very first date. "You remembered," she said quietly, looking around the familiar clearing. "I remember everything about that day," Damien said. "I've spent the last several months relearning how to remember, how to actually pay attention to the details that matter, instead of letting everything important slip past me while I focused on things that ultimately mattered so much less." He turned to face her fully, and Elena felt something shift in the air between them, an anticipation she could not quite name but felt deeply, watching Damien's expression grow serious, though warmer and more open than she had ever seen it, even during their most honest conversations of recent months. "Elena," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion clearly building beneath the surface. "I spent years building an identity around never needing anyone, around never showing weakness, around believing that strength meant never bending, never asking, never admitting that I couldn't handle something entirely on my own. I called it strength, but I understand now that it was actually a kind of cowardice, a fear of being truly known, truly vulnerable, truly dependent on another person the way real love requires." Elena's eyes glistened, watching him speak with a rawness she had waited years to witness. "The night I watched you laugh, with Julian at the gala," Damien continued, "something broke open in me that I had kept sealed for my entire adult life. I told myself it was jealousy, simple and uncomplicated, but it was so much more than that. It was the terrifying realization that I had built a life so focused on control and achievement that I had nearly lost the one thing that actually mattered more than any of it. I had nearly lost you, Elena, through nothing more dramatic than years of quiet, careless neglect, and that terrified me more than any business crisis ever could." He reached into his jacket pocket, and Elena watched, breath caught in her throat, as he withdrew a small velvet box, though she quickly realized, when he opened it, that it was not a new engagement ring, but rather her original wedding band, the one she had worn for 3 years, sent quietly weeks earlier, without her noticing, to a jeweler who had cleaned and restored it to a brilliance it had not held since their wedding day. Then, in front of her, in the same clearing where he had first told her he loved her, Damien Cole, a man who had built an entire identity around never bending, never begging, never showing weakness to anyone, slowly lowered himself to one knee. Elena's hand flew to her mouth, tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks, watching a man who commanded boardrooms and closed multi-million-dollar deals without ever raising his voice, now kneeling before her in a quiet garden clearing, vulnerable and completely undone. "I'm not asking you to marry me again, because you're already my wife, and I intend to spend the rest of my life proving that I understand exactly what that means now," Damien said, his own voice thick with emotion he no longer bothered to hide. "I'm asking you to let me start over, Elena. Not the wedding, not the vows we said years ago before I understood what they truly required. I'm asking you to let me earn, every single day from now on, the privilege of being your husband, the way I should have been earning it all along, instead of assuming it was simply owed to me because we signed a piece of paper." He took her hand gently, sliding the restored ring back onto her finger, his own hands trembling slightly, a physical tremor from a man whose composure had never once wavered in 12 years of high-stakes negotiations. "I love you," he continued, "not in the distracted, distant way I loved you for the last several years, but fully, presently, with everything I have left to give. I promise you, not with words alone, but with every day going forward, that you will never again wonder whether you matter more to me than anything else in my life. You already do, and I intend to prove it, again and again, for as long as you'll let me." Elena knelt down in front of him, closing the distance between them, cupping his face in her hands, tears still falling freely, but her expression radiant with a joy that felt, finally, completely unguarded. "I forgive you," she said softly, "not because you're perfect now, because I know you're not, and I don't need you to be. I forgive you because I've watched you become someone willing to kneel, literally and figuratively, someone willing to choose humility over pride, honesty over image, Me over everything else, even when it cost you something real. That's not the man I married 3 years ago. That's someone better, someone I'm proud to build the rest of my life with. Damien pulled her into an embrace, holding her tightly in the golden afternoon light, the two of them kneeling together in the quiet clearing, where their story had first begun years earlier, now transformed into the place where their true beginning finally took root, built not on assumption or convenience, but on hard-won honesty and genuine, deliberate choice. They stayed there for a long while, simply holding each other, neither one in any hurry to break the quiet peace of the moment, the golden leaves drifting occasionally around them in the soft autumn breeze. Eventually, they rose together, walking hand in hand back through the winding garden paths, toward the entrance, the same paths Damien had once gotten lost on years earlier, though this time, he found his way without hesitation, as though something inside him had finally settled into clarity, after months of difficult, necessary work. Months later, their marriage had settled into a rhythm neither of them had known was possible in the earlier years of quiet distance. Damien continued running Cole Enterprises with the same sharp business instincts that had always defined him, but he no longer allowed the company to consume every corner of his life. Elena, meanwhile, had taken on a more active advisory role within the company, her insights proving invaluable in ways Damien only wished he had recognized years earlier, and their partnership, both professional and personal, grew stronger with each passing month. Julian remained a good friend to them both, occasionally joining them for dinner alongside his own eventual partner, the old jealousy Damien once carried having faded entirely into simple gratitude that his wife had someone kind in her life during the difficult weeks of their separation, when Damien himself had not yet learned how to be that person for her. Victor Halbrook faded from public relevance entirely, his reputation permanently damaged by the exposed extortion attempt, a quiet consequence of choosing manipulation and pride over honest competition. Damien's father, too, seemed changed by watching his son's transformation, the two of them meeting more regularly now, their conversations gradually growing warmer and more honest than they had been in decades, a quiet echo of the healing happening within Damien's own marriage extending outward, into the relationships he had once neglected in every direction of his life. On the evening of their next wedding anniversary, nearly a year after the missed dinner that had once shattered their fragile progress, Damien arrived home early, hours before Elena expected him, the table already set, candles already lit, dinner already prepared with his own hands rather than hired help, an imperfect meal made with far more care than skill. But Elena, walking through the door to find him waiting there, felt something in her chest swell with a warmth that no perfectly catered dinner could ever have matched. "You're early," she said, smiling as she set down her bag. "I learned my lesson," Damien said, pulling out her chair with the same old-fashioned formality he had once used, though now it felt entirely natural rather than performed. "Every year from now on, I intend to be early." Elena sat down across from him, taking in the candlelight, the imperfect but heartfelt meal. The man across the table who had once been so distant she had considered walking away entirely, now present and attentive in every way that truly mattered. "To second chances," she said, raising her glass. "To choosing each other, every single day," Damien replied, raising his own glass to meet hers. "Not because it's easy, but because it's the truest, most important choice I've ever made." Outside, the evening settled into quiet darkness over the city, but inside their home, warm light filled every room, a marriage rebuilt not through grand gestures alone, but through the patient, humbling work of a man who had once believed strength meant never bending, finally understanding that the truest strength lay in his willingness, at last, to kneel.